I sat down with the winner of a 250-mile ultramarathon who took in 90% of his calories from raw milk. Mike McKnight, A.K.A. the low-carb runner, joins the show to talk about how he went from breaking his back in a ski accident to becoming the top 200-mile ultramarathon runner in the world. He also drops some dimes on how to use strength training, nutrition, and a strong mindset to overcome any hurdles that come your way. Be sure to subscribe if you guys enjoy the show. I'm going to go enjoy some raw milk. What was it about Cocodona that was different from some of the other races that you've had? Because it's not like you haven't had a win in these like 200 plus mile races. Like, you know, you're known for taking first. You have the Triple Crown of 200s. What is it about Cocodona that was so different for you?
Well, first of all, it was like so enticing because it was new. Like, I mean, 200s are still fairly new. So, I've just been doing the same 200s over and over. And then like a new one came up and sweet concept. It goes from Phoenix to Flagstaff. So, yeah, I just wanted to try something new. But every single time I did it, like it destroyed me. um, and like, I mean, the thing that makes it different from all the other races, I would say it's two things. One is the terrain is just so much harder. Like, I would say the three other 200s that I keep doing, the terrain is very similar to where I train. But like Cocodona, it's just like super rocky, and I'm not used to that. Like the trails where I'm at are buffed out, like kind of like mountain bike style type trails. And so the technicality of it has been difficult for me. It's kind of hard to train for that when you don't have technicality out your back door. And then the heat, like I've always struggled with heat. I'm getting better at it, but like just the time of year makes it so hard to get ready for it because I live in northern Utah, and every single time I leave to go to that race, like I have 3 to 6 feet of snow out my front door. Most times I'm leaving, it's snowing like the day that I'm leaving, and then I show up to the race and it's like 85 to 95 degrees. So I'm like going from 22 degrees to 85 degrees, like just like that. And it's just a huge shock to my body. So it's just really hard to prepare for.
So the first two times you did it, what gave you the most struggle in each of those races?
The heat.
That was it. That was
Well,
that was it. That was heat.
yeah, heat related issues, like specifically electrolyte imbalances. Like the first year I didn't have enough, and then the second year I had way too much. And so just trying to nail down that electrolyte balance has been difficult for me.
What did you change in your training? Like anything in terms of adding in electrolytes, messing with how much you were putting in various amounts of water? How did you come up with that balance?
Yeah, so I'd say the two biggest thing I changed were I started using more water per electrolyte. Like I used to not get enough water, and so that those electrolytes would just chill out in my gut. They weren't absorbing properly, and I would start puking or pooping too much just because my body was trying to get rid of it. And so GI issues. So yeah, doing more water for the electrolytes I was taking. And then the biggest thing the past 2 years was I would go out for 2 weeks before the race to get used to the heat. Whereas that first year, I just showed up like a day and a half, 2 days before it started, and then just got destroyed. So yeah, the heat adaptation was huge, and then just trying to nail down the water per electrolyte balance a little bit better.
Do you think that 2 weeks that you went out there and kind of like adapted to the heat, do you think that was enough? Or would you have done maybe going out there for like a week or so at some point in the training block, maybe going somewhere else that's hot, utilizing the sauna? Is there any other way besides like those 2 weeks that you can adapt to the heat?
I mean, most studies show 2 weeks is right around how long it takes to adapt. But, like, I do have a gym I go to, like, multiple times a week that has a sauna, and I have been doing that throughout the winter too, so I think that's beneficial slightly, but everything I've read says that, like, just showing up 2 weeks before and getting used to the heat for 2 weeks is enough to get ready for it. It usually takes, like, 10 to 15 days is what I've read.
So when you're thinking about Cocodona, right? You put that on the schedule. How long of a training block do you go into for that? Do you have other shorter distance races like a 50 or an 100 or something like that to use as like a training run, as funny as that is. But like when you put that on the schedule, do you like do you work backwards in terms of like how you're going to approach that, and then how long is that process in between? Like, okay, I'm choosing to do this. Now we formulate the process.
So, I mean, I would say 10 years ago when I started, that was something that I would do. I would utilize smaller races to prepare for bigger races. But, I've been doing this fairly consistently for 10 or so years now. And so I think, I believe that once you get to this point that you just have such a big enough base, if you've been consistent for those 10 years that you don't necessarily need to do that anymore. So between just having a pretty solid base for the past 10 years, I don't do that anymore. But I will say, interestingly enough, this year was my best year at Cocodona, but it was also the year that I was most undertrained from a running perspective. Because usually with Cocodona, like most ultra runners who like prioritize recovery, they usually take an off season, and it's usually like November or so to February or so, just because, it's winter in most places, and um, you don't have races that you're training for necessarily. But with Cocodona being in May, I haven't done that for the first 2 years, just because I was trying to be as ready as possible. But this year, like in Utah, like we just got dumped with so much snow that it's honestly the first year like I struggled with motivation to consistently run because of how much snow we were getting. And so from a running perspective, I was way undertrained. I won't say way undertrained. I was more undertrained than what I usually am. But like from a volume perspective, I was doing a ton of backcountry skiing. I was doing way more weightlifting than I've ever done. Way more cross training, like rowing, swimming. And so like volume wise, I was probably more trained, like when you look at it from an hour per week perspective. And so I found it very interesting that even though my mileage was down, but my volume with everything else was up, it ended up being a way better year for me.
Are you going to utilize that moving forward? More biking, hiking, swimming, rather than just time on feet for building your base and training?
Yep. Yeah. From now on, like November to February, I'm going to keep doing that because, it paid off basically.
Dude, one thing that keeps coming up, like this word that keeps coming up every time I listen to a podcast that you've been on, or I watch a YouTube video, or I watch one of your talks, I hear about your comebacks in these races. This word that keeps popping up in my head is resilience. And knowing a little bit about your backstory and the back injury that you had, and kind of using that as fuel and as a catalyst for growth, and becoming a professional ultra runner, and one of the best in the world in the 200s, if not the best in the world. How is that word resilience, like what does that mean, and how has that played such a prominent role in your life and defying the odds of what even like doctors told you can do, or I'm sure other people told you what you can do and what is possible? What does that word resilience mean to you, and how does that apply to your life?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. I just did a speaking gig about resilience recently. And I mean, it's interesting because the actual definition, like it talks about elasticity, bouncing back, making a comeback essentially. And so when you look at the actual definition, it implies that you are going to have setbacks or perceived failures. I don't believe like if you drop a race that it's a failure if you learn from like, for example, my first year at Cocodona, I dropped and had to go to the hospital because I was just so severely dehydrated. And some people would look at that as a failure, but for me, like I trained more to get ready for the heat. I kept coming back until I was finally able to conquer it. So I believe that when you have those setbacks, that they shouldn't be viewed as failures because it's just all a part of growth. It's all a part of resiliency. um if I gave up on Cocodona and never came back after that first year, then yeah, I would probably look at that as a failure. But yeah, like if you want to be a resilient person, then like when you're doing stuff like ultra running, you're pushing yourself so much that, the odds of not completing all your races or doing as good as you want at all your races are very high. And so you need to be okay with like not finishing as fast as you want to, or not even finishing, and then just learning from it and coming back and doing better. And, if you can do that, then that makes you a resilient person, in my opinion.
I heard in this past race, you were in what, like 70th place, 50 or somewhere between like 50 and 70. And your crew was telling you like, hey, you could still finish top 10. And you're like, no, I'm still gonna go for first. Like almost like an ignorance is bliss type thing, not knowing what you were truly in for. And again, seems like that's been a theme in your life, right? Like I know like after your back injury, you ended up running like a 10K race like 6 weeks later or something like that. So, how much has like a positive mindset and like a strong mindset played in being able to, come back from these struggles that you've had?
It's huge. like like all of my bad races where I didn't finish as well as I wanted to, or didn't even finish, are the races that I got like really into my head and never came out of it. Like at Cocodona that first day, yeah, so I've heard everywhere from 60 to 75th place as far back as I fell. And like that first day, I got so much into my head, like I was whining a lot, like I was ready to quit, like just not seeing any positivity. But as soon as like I started focusing on how good I was feeling, how like strong my legs felt, like everything on that first day was like just from stupid mistakes that I made. But from like a muscular standpoint, like I felt great. And so once I started focusing on how good I was feeling and just like how strong I felt, like that mindset shifted and I made that comeback. And so, I've yeah, like I think it's huge. Like if you get into your head, if you think of all the negative things, if you think about how much you're hating life, then your body, your physical power is going to match that negativity and you're going to slow down and just not do well. If you start focusing on the positive things, then your body's going to respond in a positive way, in my opinion. So, every race that I've done well at, I've seen that I've been a lot more positive for most of it.
There's a difference I feel between like being truly injured, like just being in pain and then like being ready to quit versus, you can still keep going. So almost like redlining, right? Like it's a popular term in running.
Mm.
So how do you kind of determine that in terms of like, okay, I'm in the red and I got to call it right now versus like this just sucks and I'm uncomfortable and I want to take a nap and eat a steak.
Yeah. I mean, that's a hard question. Like, you need to get a crew that knows you. Like, my crew's been with me, like Ben Light and Sarah, my wife, have been crewing me for years. And so they've gotten to a point where they just know me and they know how I respond to certain things. Like a lot of times when I'm just like whining, they can see that. Like, they can still see maybe hope in my eyes. I'm just complaining about being in pain. At Cocodona, like they could see in my eyes that I just had no interest to continue. Like usually when I'm talking to them, like I talk in a way, like if I'm just whining, I'm talking a way where I'm just like basically looking for help for them to like motivate me. But like at Cocodona, I was talking in a way just like I have no interest in you guys motivating me right now. Like I'm done. I'm hating my life. And like once a runner gets to that point, like I wasn't injured. Like it wasn't a matter of them trying to get me to stop because they were worried I was going to like hurt myself and put myself out for the season. They could just see that I made my mind up and I just had no interest in getting talked out of it. And so that's how they could tell that I was done. Um, like I even like from a redlining perspective, I don't think if you redline, you're necessarily like out or injured. You just need to like dial it back and take a good nap and eat a lot of food and reset the system. You might like if you redlined yourself, like there's a good chance that you're gonna like not finish anywhere near what you want to. You just gotta like be mentally okay with slowing down because you just fired too hard for that first day. So like even redlining, I don't think is something that you should count somebody out for in terms of finishing the race. Like legit, in my opinion, the only two reasons somebody's gonna drop is one, like you can tell if somebody's injured. Like if If your IT band's hurting, for example, that's usually result from your glute not firing or your glute just not being as strong as it should be. So there were multiple times in Cocodona when my IT band started to flare up a little, but I would just like stop and do like wall sits, but on a tree, or like at aid stations, I have resistance bands and I'd put those on and I would do like lateral band walks. I would do air squats. Sometimes I'll get my hiking pole and like kind of do like a trigger point massage in the middle of the trail and just like dig it into my glute until I find a really sore spot and then just push and hold it for like a minute. And then that usually releases my glute and then my AT band lets up. So like most like pain in these races are tightness, but like you can tell if it's going to be an injury related thing. Like if you roll your ankle and it starts swelling up, like there's a good chance you sprained it and you shouldn't run another 200 miles on it. I feel like those cases are rare, and that mostly it's just because people think their tightness is injury related, and or they're just mentally done, and no matter what their crew says to them, they're not going to get out of it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you've had a pretty, knock on wood, injury-free career, right? From, what I've heard about you, you haven't had any like major setbacks in terms of like a lot of the nagging injuries that a lot of other runners, ultra runners, and just athletes in general tend to deal with. Why do you think that is? What do you credit to being able to stay, pretty durable?
I'd say the two biggest things are my diet and then prioritizing strength and mobility. Because when I started, I wasn't prioritizing nutrition and I wasn't prioritizing strength and mobility. And I wasn't necessarily like getting injured, but like I was having like a lot of like IT band issues, for example. Like I had IT band flare ups all the time when I started and I didn't know how to take care of it. Um, but yeah, so like once I started prioritizing strength and mobility and nutrition, like all those issues essentially went away. And I could say twice out of my ultra running career, I've had like two like injuries, but even those injuries didn't put me out that much. Like a year ago, I sprained my ankle pretty badly. I rolled it on a rock and like it ballooned up bad. And this was actually like a month or a month and a half before I tried going after the Arizona Trail FKT. And I was a little bit worried I wasn't going to be able to do it, but like I essentially cleaned up my nutrition even more. I prioritized mobility even more. I did things like deep tissue massage, ozone therapy, and like within 2 weeks, I started running again when my doctor thought I was going to be out for a couple of months. And I ended up doing most of the Arizona Trail. And then a few years ago, I tore my fascia, but I did a lot, like basically the same thing. And I was only out for 3 or so weeks. So between my like two injuries, like I only had to take 5 total weeks off between those two things. So they weren't even that bad.
All right, so I know what fascia is, but I've never heard of anybody tearing their fascia, and I thought fascia goes like all throughout the body. So can you elaborate on this? It's fascinating.
Specifically the fascia in my foot,
Okay, got you.
like it's just an overuse thing. And then I tore the fascia in my foot.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And we'll definitely get into nutrition, but I want to stay on this topic of strength training for a little bit, just because I think that's super important for runners and something that is the first thing to get neglected, I would say. So, what was it that made you realize how much of a difference strength and mobility could do for you? And maybe what does your strength training routine currently look like?
So the biggest, like the way I learned the importance of, like I used to have the mindset where any time that could be spent working out should be focused on running. That's how I used to think. And then I kept having those IT band issues. And then somebody gave me the advice to just start doing 5 minutes of wall sits a day. And like within 3 days of doing that, I noticed a major difference. And so like I probably spent a good 5, 6 months doing that. And like I never had IT band issues again. And so after like a few months of that, I was just like, okay, like apparently there's something to this. And so I started doing more research and looking into it. And, you know, that was back in 2017. And, to today, like my strength and mobility routine has progressed into like almost an addiction. Like I almost love weightlifting more than I love running now. But like I do a lot of exercises to engage my glutes just because I personally believe a lot of issues that people get with running are like stemming from weak glutes or your glutes not firing. So that looks like a lot of squats, a lot of Bulgarian split squats. I do a lot of work on the Bosu ball to like work on my stabilizing muscles. So, I'll get a barbell and throw on nothing crazy, like 25-pound weights and do squats on the Bosu ball. So I'm engaging those glutes, but I'm also working on my stabilizing muscles. I'll do battle ropes with the Bosu ball. Like I do a lot with the Bosu ball. And then just like a lot of upper body stuff that will work on my shoulders and my triceps and chest, just because like, the motion of running, if you're not working on that, your arms can get fatigued. If you don't have strong shoulders, like in these 200-mile races, you have so much gear that you have to carry. Like at Cocodona, we had to carry 4 liters of water that first day, not to mention like all the required gear, like warm weather gear. So like your shoulders can get pretty fatigued if you're not working on your shoulders too. But yeah, I think 2 to 3 days a week will suffice for runners who are trying to prevent muscle imbalances. But I'm doing about 6 days a week just because I love it so much now.
So what does that 6 day a week split look like? Are you doing like a body part split, a little bit of full body every day? What does that look like?
So like 3 days a week is full body hit style type workouts. Like, I have a Tabata timer downloaded, and like one of my favorite routines is to like go out in my back patio as the sun's coming up and get morning sunlight. And I'll do like dumbbell squats with a hammer curl shoulder press, like in one motion. I'll do the ab wheel, I'll do jump rope, I'll do a lot of push-ups, military push-ups and chest push-ups, squat jumps, burpees, so like stuff like that. And that's usually about 45 minutes 3 times a week. And then 3 of the other days, it's more of like a little bit more weight style. So like today I did the ski erg machine for 15 minutes. I did battle rope for about 10 minutes. I did pull-ups. I did curls, farmer walks, stuff like that. I usually do like a chest and a leg day, Bulgarian split squats with like the Smith machine, pulling the sled backwards to engage those muscles, and then a back focus day. So typical like weightlifting stuff, maybe a little bit less weight and higher reps.
Are you writing all that programming yourself, kind of just going off a feel, or do you have somebody doing it for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a routine now, but when I started, I just kind of like walked around. I was like, oh yeah, this looks like a cool one. And I just kind of put my own thing together.
Hey, a little bit of something's better than a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about mobility? That's definitely something that for me as a runner now, I have to put a lot more time and attention to. Otherwise, I start to feel it. So, what does your mobility routine look like?
I mean, typical foam rolling and stretching. Recovery is a part of mobility. So like I'll use the compression boots too. Um, Like one of my workouts that I do, it's like fully body weight, and I think a lot of it is like mobility specific style movements, like figure four squats. I'm not sure if you know what those are.
I don't.
It's it's basically like, so like you're standing up and then you bring one of your foot above your knee, and so like it
Okay.
looks like you're making a four,
Yeah.
and then you basically kind of like bend forward and squat, and it like makes your glute stretch a little bit. I don't know if
I'm
that's
in,
making sense.
no, 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 100%. I know a figure four like stretches when you're laying down, so I was just picturing
Yeah.
you doing that like standing up. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that seems like it'd be a tough one.
Yeah, it is. So like that, pistol squats, side lunges, which is more of just like stretching your groin basically, but stuff like that.
Okay, cool. Do you incorporate any sort of like plyometrics or anything like that? Because one thing I realized doing my first trail run was okay, like basically, especially when you're running downhill and doing like downhill technical running, I was like, okay, plyometric work. Like, luckily, I've done so much of it in my life playing football. I've done so many like lateral movements and plyometrics that was able to help. That I realized, okay, definitely got to do a lot of that. You had already touched on it, glute strength, that was big. But also like core strength, I felt too, like especially on like those downhill technical runs. Like I felt myself like having to really brace my core, especially if you're like jumping off of a rock and landing and like having to like keep going without turning it into a full on sprint.
Yeah. I mean, Core is a huge one. I don't know if you've seen at the end of these races, like the people who come in and they're like leaning really bad. So
Yep.
that's usually from what I've seen related to a weak core. And so I do implement core throughout the week. Everybody I coach, I give them core workouts to do. So I do think core is important. And then really the only lateral type movements I do are lateral banded walks. Sometimes at the gym, I'll throw down a ladder and like do like those football style movements where you move your feet real quick through the ladder. But I've seen just like lateral band walks and engaging like exercises to engage my glutes have been enough, really.
So, do you also see you mentioned, like, doing some deep tissue work and things like that. Are there any other recovery modalities that you like to use or utilize maybe before a race, maybe after a race, or just, in general to keep yourself feeling fresh?
I mean, aside from the basics of like I think like from like a good, better, best perspective, you have stretching, and then you have foam rolling, and then you have deep tissue massages, and then you have dry needling. And so like I don't have like a set route. Like I try to stretch and foam roll every day and use my compression boots every day. But outside of that, I don't have anything really set. I just kind of listen to my body. And like if foam rolling's not cutting it, I'll go in and get a deep tissue massage. Usually that does it. Some cases it won't. And if that doesn't do it, that's when I'll look into like dry needling. But yeah, usually it's like stretching, then foam rolling, then deep tissue massages for me.
So, kind of even taking a little bit of a step back here, why 200 milers, right? Like it, because me when I first started getting into running, I was like, oh my gosh, like a hundred miles. That is absurd. Why would anybody ever want to put themselves through that? And now, they have a good amount of 200s throughout the country, and I don't know, maybe throughout the world. I'm not. I'm newer to the ultra running space, but why did you decide to start to really focus on these 200 milers versus 50Ks, 50 milers, 100 milers, 100 to 200? So yeah.
So it started out with just I wanted to progress and see what I could do. Like after I completed the 100-mile distance, I honestly thought that was like the glass ceiling. Like I thought that was what everybody worked towards. And then I learned about 200 milers and I was like, okay, well, like I'm doing this sport because I want to grow and progress and see what I can do. So I obviously got to try it and see if I can do it. And so once I did it, it then transitioned to like, okay, so my first 200 was the year that I also did my first triple crown of 200s. And like all three of those races were essentially just trying to survive. Like that was before I was doing strength and mobility. That was before I was cleaning up my nutrition. So like the IT band flare up happened a lot. I got what I think is a stress fracture at one of them in my shin. And so like it was just survive and finish basically. And so after that, I was like, okay, like I ended up winning the triple crown that year, but it was the first year there was a triple crown and there was like 12 of us who did it. So like like I mean it was still like awesome. It was my first time ever winning something. But like I remember thinking like, well gosh, if I can win it and like I felt like I was just surviving, like if I can fix all those issues and come back in a couple of years and do it again, like I really think that I can like blow my time out of the water. And so I did come back 2 years later in 2019 and um with the goal of just like bettering my time at all the races, seeing what I can do, feeling healthy and strong. And like during all that, I ended up winning each individual race and then setting some form of course record on each individual race. And so after that, that's when I was like, oh wow, like maybe I'm like actually good at this distance. Like up until that point, everything I was doing was just to like better myself and see what my body could do. And then when I won those three races, I was like, okay, like I might be good at this distance. So let's keep focusing on it. And so it started out as just seeing what I could do. And then it transitioned to like, this is just unfortunately what I'm good at. Like I would love to be great at the 50K, get out there and be done in 4 hours for the day, or even a 100 miler, like, Western States, like Jim Walmsley, he's doing that in under 15 hours. So he's still not having to be out there that long. So I would love to be good at the distance where, I'm done within a day, but you know, it's nice to be good at something, but also sometimes I'm just like, holy cow, why do I have to be good at a distance that I'm out here for 2, sometimes 3 days. Like, but yeah, that's kind of how it transitioned.
So I know it's dependent on the course, but how do you approach like your pacing and your strategy for kind of how fast you're going to go? Because obviously you're not running to, especially with a insane amount of vert on some of these courses. You're not running it the entire time. There's a lot of power hiking involved. There's obviously power naps and things like that. Some sleep going on there. So how do you approach your pacing strategy going into some of these races?
I mean, from a pacing perspective, it's pretty simple. Like I just try to keep my heart rate around 135, like maybe 140 for all of it, and then I just let my pace dictate itself based off of that heart rate. Um, and usually, what that looks like is like Cocodona was kind of an exception. Like I've never fallen that far back before, but like usually I'll settle in between fifth and 10th place for the first 80 miles, and then I'll get into like the 3 to 5th range, at that point. And then it's not common for me not to catch first till around 150. So I usually just try to stay super consistent and then keep that consistency to the finish versus a lot of people who go out too far hard and then kind of blow up and slow down a lot. So from a pacing perspective, I just work on like 135 heart rate and just try to be consistent as possible. From a sleeping standpoint, that's probably going to change after Cocodona because historically I would push through the first night just because I believe anybody can push through 24 hours without needing sleep. And then usually after that 24 hours, the sun comes up and that rejuvenates me a little bit and I'm able to keep going throughout that day. And then that second night, I usually keep going until I start falling asleep. And then I'll take 1 to 2 20 to 30-minute dirt naps and then just rely on caffeine till I get to the finish. But, after Cocodona, like that first night, just because like I was so mentally done, like I slept roughly 3.5 to 4 hours on that first night, just because in my head I was just like I got to my crew, I was like, guys, I feel like junk. I'm probably gonna quit. I'm gonna go sleep in my tent. Don't wake me up. Like I was just like so mentally tapped out that I didn't even care how long I was gonna sleep. And that ended up being about 3.5 or 4 hours. And then after that, like I felt so good for the rest of the race. And I had a ton of PRs on the course. Um, the guy who won the race last year, who threw down a solid time last year, once I started making my comeback, the people on the live feed started comparing his time from aid station to aid station versus my time. And like fairly consistently, I was going faster than him for about 45 minutes to an hour and a half in each section. And so just seeing like how much stronger I was able to run that final, what that ended up being like 180 miles, like that to me, like I'm highly looking at like strategizing my sleep schedule because I mean the data, at least for this, shows that sleeping early and then catching up uh, later in the race like paid off.
It works, it works, constantly
Yeah,
being able to adapt and adjust. I love that.
yeah,
Uh, is it also true? I heard that for for most of this race, you took in about 90% of your calories from raw milk. Is that true?
yeah. Yeah, whenever my stomach goes south, I like any kind of solid food, if it touches my tongue, I get this weird gag reflex. Like I only puked once at Cocodona, but every single time I tried to eat something that wasn't liquid, like I basically just had to like power eat that thing because if it sat on my tongue too long, I'd gag and I couldn't swallow it. And so I just got to the point where I was just like, this is really annoying because I had to stop to do it. I couldn't do it while I was running. And so essentially between aid stations, I didn't eat that much. And then I'd come into the aid station and since liquids were fine, I would just pull out a thing of raw milk and chug like, I had like a bunch of half-gallon containers. And so I would chug close to half of that every single time I came into an aid station. And I mean, from a nutrition perspective, like it was whole raw milk. So I'm getting a ton of fat, I'm getting a ton of calories, I'm getting a ton of protein. And like milk also has a bunch of natural sugars. So I'm getting a bunch of carbs. Like, in my opinion, it's one of the most complete forms of like nutrition out there. And it's also a probiotic, so it can settle your stomach down a little bit. So like going into it, it turned like it basically was I was just trying to survive. But like now that I'm done and thinking about it, like in my head, it just makes sense that it's like a really, assuming your stomach can handle it. And my stomach can't handle it. I've grown up on a dairy farm and I've drinking raw milk my whole life. And so I think it's definitely something I'm going to start utilizing more at my future races.
So your alias is the low carb runner. And, why are you so passionate about that? And, how has your how has your journey through with nutrition changed over the years? And, how has a low carb approach helped you kind of optimize your performance?
Yeah. So I guess it makes sense to share why I dove into it to begin with. But when I started running 10 years ago, like I just adopted the eat whatever you want approach. Like calories in, it's the same as calories out. So, if I burned 1,000 calories in a workout, like, yeah, go buy a pizza and eat a bunch of pizza and make up those calories. And early on, like I noticed I started gaining weight, which kind of was weird for me to see because like I started running more, but I was gaining weight. And so that was kind of my first red flag. And then second, every single race I did, it was like a 50-50 chance on whether I was going to have stomach issues or energy issues. And the reason that was is because I was trying to eat as many calories as everybody was telling me to eat. And, I'm a bigger guy. I'm 6'1". At the time, I was 195 pounds. So with that weight, I need more calories to sustain energy. But like all those calories, my body just couldn't digest it and process it. So I'd puke a lot at all my races. And then I'd go into my next race and I didn't want to puke. So I would try to lower my calories and then I would just have energy issues. Like I'd lose all my energy and just slow down to a death crawl because I wasn't getting enough calories. So I'd have energy issues from just not eating enough calories. And so I started doing research. I learned about like at the time a ketogenic approach. And in theory, it was telling me that I would, train myself to become fat adapted. And if I was fat adapted, theoretically, that would fix my energy issues because I'd be more more efficient at burning fat for fuel. And our bodies, just like biologically, we have way more fat storage than we can handle, like glucose, glycogen. And so it looked like it would fix my energy issues. And then two, theoretically, I wouldn't have to eat as much because I was fat adapted. And so that might help my stomach issues. And so when I started, like I went full on keto, I noticed there was obviously an adaptation period, like, for people who are so reliant on carbohydrates, once you cut those carbohydrates out, like you feel like death for a little bit. And so I did have energy issues at first, but I had the confidence that it would resolve itself and it eventually did. And I had more consistent energy. I started eating less and started having less stomach issues. I started losing that weight that I was gaining. And so at first, like I was pretty, aside from like the cheat, like after every race, I would cheat for like a week and just like pump my body full of junk. And aside from that, though, I was strict keto. To today, though, it's transitioned to low carb. Like, my alias is not the ketogenic runner. It's not the carnivore runner. It's the low carb runner. And so, I've transitioned from getting like 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates a day to getting about 150 or so grams a day consistently. Like, right now you've seen me spoonful feeding myself some food right now. And it's a bowl of berries, cherries, banana, mango with some heavy cream and pure maple syrup on it. So, this bowl probably has about 70 or 80 grams of carbohydrates in it, which is by far not ketogenic. um, but 150 grams of carbohydrates in a day is significantly lower than like a standard American diet. Like there's a lot of people who are getting 500 to 600 grams of carbohydrates in a day. And so for me, like it's transitioned to like just a lot more whole foods. Like the ketogenic diet, as good as it is for cleanses and losing weight, like I do think it's turning into too much of like a dirty keto. Like people are still eating a bunch of processed junk on the keto diet. It just has like different natural sweeteners in it versus sugar, or they're pumping it full of fiber so they can like advertise it as a low net carb. So I do think people can fall into the trap of just like still eating a bunch of processed junk on the ketogenic diet. But, for me every day now, like I eat a bunch of red meat, I eat a bunch of eggs and a bunch of raw milk and then a bunch of fruit. So, it's definitely a lot more whole foods approach now. But and from what I've seen, it hasn't affected my ability to burn fat for fuel. Like I'll track my glucose with CGM monitors, I'll track my ketones, and then just track my energy and my ability to do intermittent fasting, for example. And it doesn't seem like anything's changed since upping my carbs. Um, the only thing that's changed really is I just have more energy because I'm still getting a better amount of carbohydrates.
Now, I know this is for you. You mentioned like during those races, you're never really getting above a heart rate of like 140. So you're kind of staying in that like lower zone, like zone 2 fat burning heart rate zone. For a runner who's maybe trying to do like optimize a shorter distance, like a marathon, for example, like when I was trying to run a sub 3 hour marathon, I was eating like 400 plus grams of carbohydrates a day, and since running this ultra this past weekend, I've done kind of what you've done, like a lower carb approach, upping the fats, keeping protein higher, and I feel super sharp. I already see like aesthetically, I'm starting to get leaner for sure, and mentally, again, like I've just felt like super clear. So all that to say is like for somebody who's trying to optimize in like a shorter distance, like a marathon, a half marathon, or below, do you think that a lower carb approach would not be as beneficial? And, you know, if not, is there value in like maybe having like some sort of off season to get your body more efficient at burning fat for fuel? So then when you go into that like training block for it, you're not having to rely so much on your glycogen stores?
Yeah, that's a good question. um, I do think like 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, marathons, maybe even 50Ks, maybe even 50 milers. Like, I don't know if a low carb approach would be as beneficial. Um, 5Ks and 10Ks and half marathons, I don't think it would be, and marathons too. But I mean, that's the hard thing with this. Like, once you start, like, I can't describe how good I feel eating this way. And like, if there came a day when all of a sudden, like, I started having tons of issues with my running and I sucked at it, like, but I still felt good eating the way that I did, I would have a really hard time changing my nutritional approach. Just be like, so like if I was starting to focus on 5Ks, 10Ks, and half marathons, like in concept, I know that it would be beneficial for me to start having more carbohydrates, but I don't know if I could do it because I just love how I feel. Um, naturally, like in my head, I'd be like, okay, just up my fruit intake, but like fruit is so sweet. And if you add a little bit of maple syrup to it, it's even that much more sweeter. Like, for my kids, like we were just at some friends over the weekend and like my friends made cake for everybody. And I was just like, oh, we don't need that for my kids. I'm going to get them some fruit with some maple syrup. And like my kids loved it. Their kids ended up not wanting the cake and wanted the fruit with the syrup. Like, if kids choose that over cake, like that shows how sweet it is. And so I don't know if I could up my fruit intake because of how sweet it is. So that would just so yeah, I agree with you. Like a low carbohydrate approach wouldn't be good for those distances, but me, I don't know if I could do it. I
Yeah,
don't know if that
for
makes sense.
no, it absolutely makes sense. Kind of just circling back to like the second part, that was a long-winded
Oh yeah.
question that I
I'm
asked.
sorry.
No, you're all good. I tend to ask those long-winded questions sometimes. So, the second part of that was like, and I asked this kind of selfishly because I do want to get back into um, attempting to run that sub 3 hour marathon later on this year. But this summer, I'm focusing on leaning out a little bit. Want to focus on getting a little bit faster, not putting on not as much volume, a little more speed work. Um, but I want to get my body more efficient at burning fat for fuel. So I'm curious if you've had any experience doing that, or if like basically what I'm doing right now would be counterintuitive.
No, okay. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that question. Um, so let me put it this way. From what I've studied, most of our bodies, give or take a little bit, because everybody's different, but most of us can store roughly 2,000 grams of glycogen. And most body types store around 40,000 grams of fat. And so obviously the fat storage is a bigger storage, and it would make sense to utilize that more for an ultra. Um, where we can only store roughly 2,000 grams of glycogen, like I feel like you could top that out within a week or two just by like doing a little bit of a carb load. And let me like kind of two-part this answer. Do you know who Zach Bitter is?
Of course, I had him on the podcast recently.
Oh, okay, cool. And so I recently learned that he, a week or two before his races, will start kind of feeding himself a little bit more processed foods. So for me, like I used to love like Siete tortilla chips and Siete potato chips, and mostly because their tortilla chips are grain free, and then their potato chips are cooked in avocado oil instead of seed oils. And so for Cocodona, like even for like a 200, you're going to be eating processed foods, like especially on that first stage, just because it's a good way for your body to get used to digesting food while you're working out. And, later in the race is when I'll start doing more real food, like bunless burgers and stuff like that. And so like, even for me at Cocodona, I started feeding myself more processed foods a week or two before the race, just to get my body used to processed foods in my gut again. And so I think like it would be a similar concept for a 5K, 10K half marathon. Like if you like eating this way, eat this way for the majority of the year. And then, maybe 2 or so weeks before your race, just start upping your carbohydrates more with a little bit more processed style type foods. And I would guess that would be enough to top off your glycogen, and it'd be enough to like give you enough carbohydrates to, kind of crush that race.
No, that's great advice. And I know we got to wrap this thing up. I want to be respectful of your time. I'm curious, what does a day of eating, you mentioned it a little bit now, but you maybe start to finish, what does a typical day of eating look like for you on a day where you're doing like, a standard training day?
I basically eat the same thing every day now. And usually what that looks like is around 6 or so eggs in the morning with a lot of like grass-fed butter, raw cheese, some guacamole. And then I top that off with a bowl of like that fruit concoction that I just told you about. And then a shaker bottle full of raw milk and creatine. And then for lunch, like I'll maybe do like 2 or 3 ounces of beef liver. So with a little bit of bone broth too. So not a lot of calories, but still like heavy protein focus. And then for dinner, it's typically some sort of ground beef concoction, whether that's just like bunless burgers with guac and cheese, or sometimes like I'll air fry it and make kind of like a stroganoff type thing and use Primal Kitchen Alfredo sauce because they use pretty good ingredients. And then I'll usually pour that over like pork rinds to give it some crunch. And that's typically basically what I eat every day. Sometimes I'll make an egg salad with my burgers, but that's roughly what I'm doing every single day.
Besides eating the liver, it's very similar to what I do in terms of just eating whole foods, a lot of meat, red meat, raw dairy, fruit. If you can just eat more natural things, I think we would all be better off as a society. So, Mike,
Agreed.
this has been awesome. We'll definitely have to get you on the pod again, just because I definitely want to dive a little bit deeper into this. But before I let you go, I got to ask you a question I ask all my guests when they come on. This is the Pure Ambition podcast. So when you hear those words, what do they mean to you, and how do they apply to your daily life?
Pure ambition, in my opinion, means that you're good with being, you're comfortable with being uncomfortable. So for me, like my slogan for my coaching and just for like my life is comfort is a waste of potential. And so I believe that if you can adapt that style of thinking, then that will give you that pure ambition, with wanting to better yourself, be cool with being uncomfortable. Like there's no growth that comes from the comfort zone. I'm sure you've heard that saying before too. But so yeah, the more ambitious you are, the more comfortable you are with being uncomfortable.
I love that. Mike, thank you. This has been awesome. If people want to check out more of your content, where can they go?
The low carb runner on Instagram, and then low carb dash runner is my website.
Beautiful. Mike, thank you so much. Congrats again on winning Cocodona, and excited to have you on again soon.
Thank you. Excited to be on again.
Thank you guys for tuning into another episode of the Pure Ambition podcast. Please leave a rating and review on the platform that you are listening, as it helps the show grow so that we can reach more people with the intent of empowering others to become the best versions of themselves and live a life worth remembering. If you're ready to take your fitness, mindset, and lifestyle to the next level, head to the link in the show notes and join the Pure Ambition group on Upspace for workouts, recipes, routines, and a community ready to help you thrive. See you in the next one.